Hey guys, tonight we're heading deep into the frostbitten silence of the Arctic. The wind is howling outside your sealskin tent, your eyelashes are freezing together, and the snow stretches in every direction like some kind of white screen of death. You can't see a tree for 100 miles, your phone battery died 6 minutes into the trip, and if someone handed you a compass right now, you'd probably try to eat it. You probably won't survive this, but hey, at least you'll know how Inuit Driftwood maps worked. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're trudging across an unmarked expanse of snow, every step a squeaky crunch beneath your boots. There's no Google Maps. No cell towers. No trail markers, signs, or footprints. Just your own breath clouding up the frozen air, and a strange piece of driftwood in your hand. It looks like nothing. Just a rough little stick, maybe a child's abandoned toy. But it's not. It's your map. For Inuit peoples living across the Arctic, from Greenland to Canada to Alaska, navigation was a survival skill woven into everyday life. And in an environment where the sun disappears for half the year and snow flattens everything into an icy featureless pancake, traditional cartography didn't stand a chance. Enter the tactile map, a surprisingly elegant, low-tech solution made from whatever the sea decided to spit out. That stick in your hand. That's your coastline. The ridges, bays and inlets. That divot near your thumb. That's the river mouth where the fish practically jump into your arms, on a good day, anyway. And this long curve? That's the peninsula that takes 3 days to cross unless you're lucky with the wind. Inuit Driftwood maps were never meant to be looked at from above, like those colorful European charts with sea monsters in the margins. They were meant to be held, felt, memorized, like holding a piece of the world itself. Historians still argue whether these maps were used primarily by elders teaching young hunters or whether they were actively carried and consulted during travel. What we do know is that these maps were astonishingly accurate, without the benefit of writing, measuring tools, or satellite photos. And before you say, well, it's easy to remember stuff if you live there all the time, let's just pause and recall how many times you've walked the same city block and still had to check Google Maps to find your dentist's office. So how did they do it? Part of the magic is embedded in Inuit culture's unique relationship with space and memory. In the West, we tend to think of maps as objective diagrams, here's north, here's the lake, don't get eaten by a bear. But for the Inuit, maps weren't just guides, they were deeply personal, sensory tools that merged geography with experience. They weren't just about where you were going, they were about how it felt to get there. Imagine this. You're a young Inuit, maybe 12 winters old. You're traveling for the first time without your uncle. The sea ice crackles under your dog's leg, and you're gripping a piece of driftwood he carved by hand. Every bump under your fingers means something, a memory, a direction, a story. He told you, when you feel this notch, start listening for the wind. It shifts by that island. You don't need a map to look at. You have a map to remember. And let's not forget, driftwood was rare and precious in the treeless Arctic. Most of it floated in from Siberia or the Pacific, carried by ocean currents over thousands of miles. Every piece was a kind of gift from the sea, and every one that washed ashore might become a bowl, a tool, or, yes, a map. There's something poetic about it, really, using a wandering piece of wood to navigate a wandering life. Kind of like taking a message in a bottle and turning it into a GPS. One of the best preserved examples of these maps comes from the 1880s, when a Greenland Inuit named Inuit traveled with a Danish explorer and carved a map of the coastline from memory. When later compared with actual geographic surveys, his carving matched the coastline perfectly. Even the fjords and tiny coves lined up. Just think about that the next time your GPS reroutes you down a dead-end alley because of a traffic slowdown. But not all driftwood maps were so precise. Some were symbolic, just broad strokes meant to evoke a general region, or to illustrate a single journey rather than an entire area. And that's where modern scholars get into debates. Were these carvings intended for navigation in the field, or were they tools for storytelling and memory work, passed around the fire as part of an oral tradition? The answer is probably yes. Yes to both. And maybe to more. You're sitting now beside that same fire, watching someone older carve careful lines into a damp, weathered plank. He's not just tracing a map, he's retracing a life. You can almost hear the dogs panting, feel the sway of the sled. The map isn't just a set of directions, it's a replay button for memory. A documentary in wood. Quirky fact break. Sure. Did you know that some Inuit could also navigate using the way snow drifts form? There's a word for it, sastrugi. The ridges point in specific directions, sculpted by prevailing winds. So even the snow becomes a map, just one that melts when it's tired of helping. Meanwhile, that driftwood stick in your hand grows heavier. Not in weight, but in meaning. You start to feel it differently, less like a tool, more like a relationship. Like holding hands with the land itself. And you wonder, how did this start? Who first picked up a useless log and thought, this will tell me where the whales are? Maybe you'll never know. But the wind outside is rising again, and the tent creaks, and the map is still warm from the firelight. You hold it a little tighter. And somewhere in that rough grain, a whole world begins to unfold. You're still sitting by the fire, the glow flickering across your face, that carved driftwood map nestled in your lap like a sleeping animal. Outside, the wind is busy trying to peel the skin off the earth, but inside your little shelter of skins and snow blocks, there's a kind of stillness. The kind that lets you ask a simple question: what did people do before paper? Let's be honest. You've probably crumpled up 5 sticky notes today and still forgot what they said. But in the Arctic, where trees are about as common as vending machines, paper was never an option to begin with. And so, the Inuit leaned into what they had: memory, wood, bone, and storytelling. When you live in a world where survival depends on knowing exactly where the ice thins or where the seals breathe, you don't leave that knowledge lying around on fragile parchment. You build it into your life. Maps, in this world, were rarely flat and never folded. You couldn't write your way across the tundra, you had to remember your way. Entire coastlines lived in the curve of your palm. A bend in the river wasn't just a line on a page, it was the spot where your cousin broke his sled and the dogs ran wild for 2 days. Navigation was less about symbols and more about sensations, where the snow changes texture, where the wind smells like open water. Mainstream history tells us the Inuit developed astonishing spatial memory from a young age. Children were trained to notice every tiny shift in their environment. One rock leaning the wrong way. That's not just a rock, it's a landmark. And while some cultures built massive monuments to be remembered, the Inuit built memories into the very act of walking. You'd hike a route 100 times, told the same story 100 different ways, until the story was the route. There's an open scholarly debate about whether this oral mapping tradition was a workaround or a deliberate choice. Some argue the Inuit would have used paper if they had it, others say the tactile, embodied knowledge was superior in its own way. After all, a paper map can blow away. A driftwood map might float for years. But the memory of your grandfather describing the shape of a bay while whittling seal bone? That's carved into your brain, not just the wood. And not all maps were made for travel. Some were made just to remember. Picture a family sitting around a whale oil lamp, passing around a carved piece of driftwood like a board game. One elder points to a notch, that's where we saw the narwhal. Another nods, no, it was further south, remember the ice had cracked open. A map becomes a negotiation, a memory game, a shared story you hold in your hands. Here's your quirky tidbit for the night: some Inuit even encoded maps into songs. Yep, singable, melodic maps. Instead of a melody about love and heartbreak, you'd get verses like, "Past the wide bay where the wind grows teeth/paddle till the rocks turn red and steep." It's like GPS directions, but more poetic, and less likely to mispronounce local names. You close your eyes and imagine paddling through fog, singing your way down the coast, each note a new clue. The sea groans beneath you, the kayak creaks, and the map is in your voice, not your backpack. Who needs Siri when you've got a lullaby that keeps you alive? But back to that driftwood. You flip it in your hand now, trying to read its bumpy lines the way you trace a vein on your arm. It's not map in the modern sense. There's no legend, no north arrow, no scale. It doesn't tell you how far something is in miles, it tells you how it feels to get there. That long curve on the bottom edge. It might mean, takes 2 days if the wind's right, or, don't camp here, the spirits don't sleep. One edge of your map is broken, worn down by years of hands and weather. You can imagine a child learning that coastline by running her fingers over it every night like a bedtime story. And you can imagine the grief when that piece of wood split, or fell in the fire. Not just because the object was lost, but because a part of someone's mind, someone's memory, was carved into it. In that way, each driftwood map is like a diary with no words. A journal in splinters. Historians often struggle to date these maps. They weren't signed or labeled. Some may have lasted generations, others a single season. They weren't made for museums. They were made for motion. Meant to be touched, passed around, felt in the dark while the ice cracked under your sled. And the fact that even a few have survived is nothing short of miraculous. Now imagine being the person who first had to convince a skeptical elder that carving a piece of driftwood might be useful. No, really, if we notch this bit here, it'll remind us where the tide turns. Probably got a very Arctic version of, just use your brain like the rest of us. But eventually, it stuck. Not the idea of maps, maybe, but the idea of memory you could touch. And here's something else, these tactile maps weren't just Inuit. The Chukchi of Siberia, the Sami of Scandinavia, even Polynesian wayfarers used similar techniques, shells, sticks, stones, to encode geography through the fingers. It's as if humans, no matter where they are, instinctively reach for something solid to anchor memory. Something we can hold when everything else is fluid. You glance at your own hands now. Imagine growing up knowing that these hands wouldn't just carry your tools or paddle your boat, they'd be your compass. Your calendar. Your archive. It's not that the Inuit lacked writing. They just wrote in skin, snow, wood, and air. You might think this makes it easy to lose information. And you'd be right. Every time a driftwood map rots, or is burned for heat, or swept away in a storm, a whole world goes with it. That's the tragic trade-off of ephemeral knowledge. But it's also what makes it feel so alive. These maps were never just coordinates. They were relationships, built over time and held close, often literally. The fire's getting low now. You wrap your coat tighter. The driftwood is warm from your hands, and the thought crosses your mind, you could carve something into it. Just a line, maybe a notch. Mark tonight. Mark this moment. Maybe someone else will trace it someday and wonder who made that line, and why. Your fingers rest on the map's ridges, and you start to notice the subtle differences in depth. Some grooves are sharp and shallow, like fresh cuts, others are worn smooth, the echo of 100 thumbs tracing the same coastline. It's strange how your hand can begin to learn something before your brain does. And that's the whole point. In the Arctic, where you can't rely on a compass needle spinning helplessly near the magnetic pole, you need a different kind of orientation, one that lives in your skin. Picture this, you're a young hunter, maybe 15. The first time you're allowed to travel alone. Not far, just to the next camp, but still, it feels like a personal moon landing. Your father hands you a piece of driftwood, barely the size of a loaf of bread. He doesn't say much. Just, follow this. And somehow, that chunk of wood, with its mysterious ridges and notches, becomes your North Star. One mainstream historical account describes Inuit boys learning routes by heart before they were even tall enough to see over a snowbank. Their elders would drag a finger down a carved edge and narrate the journey aloud. Here, the ice breaks early. Here, you stay away from the cliffs because of falling snow. And this? He'd tap a small groove near the bottom. This is where your uncle saw the lights dance like fire across the sea. Not a warning, not a landmark, just a memory. The map holds more than geography, it cradles experience. You slip into that role now. You're not just the listener anymore, you're the one making the journey. And as you go, you realize that a tactile map demands something of you. It's not passive. You can't glance at it and move on. You have to feel it, engage with it, ask it questions. In that way, it becomes more like a conversation than a tool. Or maybe even a partner, something that knows the land a little better than you do and is willing to remind you, gently, where not to fall through the ice. Quirky tidbit time: did you know some Inuit maps were made not just from driftwood, but from ivory? Yep. Old walrus tusks carved into terrain. Super fancy, but also incredibly durable. Like, outlast your sled and probably your grandchildren, durable. And sometimes, they weren't even used to navigate in the present. They were records, chronicles of a route that had changed, or maybe no longer existed. A ghost map. A story with no destination. There's an open scholarly debate about whether these maps were purely utilitarian or whether they also held ceremonial meaning. Some anthropologists argue that the repetition of tracing routes was meditative, almost spiritual. Others insist it was purely practical, just an efficient way to train children and plan hunts. But honestly, when you're sitting in a snow shelter with only the wind and the memory of your ancestors for company, those two things start to feel very much the same. As you keep tracing the wood, you notice something curious. There's no consistent scale. Some features are exaggerated, others reduced. That's because tactile maps weren't meant to be mathematically precise, they were emotionally precise. Think about how you remember your neighborhood. Your favorite cafe feels bigger than the supermarket, even though it's half the size. The same goes here. The inlet where your family camps every spring might be carved larger, deeper, more lovingly than the dangerous cliff you pass quickly and with little affection. And let's not forget weather. In the Arctic, the same path can look completely different depending on the season. What's a smooth ride in February becomes a death trap in May. So the maps were less about fixed terrain and more about navigating change. They whispered, "Watch out, this part gets tricky when the wind shifts," without ever saying a word. You imagine passing the map along to your own child someday. Showing them how the shape of a curve means, "Turn your sled here," and how a nick on the edge means, "Don't trust the snow this deep into spring." That level of intergenerational transfer isn't something you read about on a plaque in a museum. It's something you live. And the map, well, it becomes a kind of family heirloom, except instead of silver or gold, it's worn with that smells faintly of salt and smoke. Now, not all maps were individual masterpieces. Some were collaborative. In a large camp, multiple hunters might work on the same piece, each adding a detail only they knew. One might add the shallow water markers. Another remembers where the whales breached last season. And soon, what started as a smooth stick turns into a collective mind, stitched together by memory and the odd argument about which island is closer. You might be wondering, how did these maps travel? The answer is, lightly. They slipped into sled bags, tied to belts, tucked into fur coats. Compact and sturdy, they were far better suited for Arctic travel than paper, which would just crumple, tear, or freeze. And when you lost one, you didn't panic. You just remembered harder. Because by then, you'd traced it so many times, the grooves lived in your fingertips. Here's something to marvel at: early European explorers were baffled by Inuit navigational skills. Some wrote in their journals about being led across white voids with no visible landmarks, certain they were hopelessly lost, only to emerge, hours later, exactly where their guides had promised. One captain likened the experience to being led by a man who sees invisible roads. Spoiler, the roads weren't invisible. They were just memorized. And sometimes, the maps weren't used at all during travel. They were studied before a journey, and then left behind. That's right, just like cramming for a test and then walking in with nothing but a pen and raw courage. You'd run your fingers over the route a dozen times, maybe more, until it burned itself into your brain. Then, off you went. Sled packed. Dogs yipping. No GPS, no paper, just you and the snow, and the memory of a piece of wood you left behind on purpose. That's the quiet power of the Inuit map. It teaches you that knowing a place doesn't mean you've been there recently. It means you felt it in your bones, listened to someone who did, and carried that knowing forward. You look down at the carved driftwood one more time. A tiny chip near the edge catches your thumb. Maybe it was an accident. Maybe it marked a time when someone turned back, chose safety over pride. Either way, it's part of the story now. And you're learning to read it. Your breath fogs in the cold, crisp air, and beneath your mittens, you still feel the ghost of the wood's ridges. Even now, miles away from the actual map, your fingers seem to remember. They twitch slightly, as if trying to trace grooves that aren't there. That's the thing no one really tells you, these tactile maps don't just stick to your hands. They creep into your muscles, into your posture, into the way your shoulders rise slightly just before the land dips, as though you're anticipating a hill you learned by touch. Tonight, your sled glides silently over a frozen inlet. Moonlight scatters across the snow like powdered diamonds. You should be nervous, you're alone, after all, but there's something reassuring about this part of the journey. You know the shape of the land. Not from looking at it, but from feeling it over and over again. And somehow, that familiarity fills the dark with warmth. A mainstream historical fact worth remembering: the earliest known tactile Inuit maps date back at least to the 19th century, but the oral tradition that supported them is much older, likely thousands of years. What's been preserved in museums and academic journals is only a snapshot of a system that once pulsed vibrantly across generations. For every piece of driftwood that survived, there are countless more that wore out, burned up, or melted into memory. The idea that a culture could map the world with no paper, no ink, and no need to see the ground from above. That baffled European colonizers. To them, maps were objects, fixed, visual, impersonal. But Inuit maps? They were performative. You didn't just use them, you became them. You moved like them. You remembered through them. Here's a fringe tidbit to chew on: some elders claimed they could navigate with their eyes closed, using only the feel of the wind, the give of snow underfoot, and their muscle memory. They didn't even need the map anymore because they were the map. Try explaining that to your GPS when it reroutes for the fourth time because of traffic. So how does this driftwood magic actually work in motion? Imagine this: you're crossing the tundra, and you feel the wind shift. Not a lot, just a whisper's worth. It brushes your cheek differently, hits your ears at a slant. That tells you a ridge is coming up on your left. A slight rise, just enough to funnel the wind. Your body leans slightly right, anticipating. Sure enough, a hill crests gently beside you. You don't have to check. You know. Because it's in your shoulders, your spine, your feet. The same way you instinctively slow down when walking on gravel versus hardwood, your body responds to remembered terrain. You are, quite literally, walking through memory. But here's the twist: not all tactile maps looked the same. Some were more abstract, made only of key touch points, like a cheat sheet before a test. Others were almost sculptural, carved in 3 dimensions with exaggerated landforms. And once in a while, you'd find a piece so intricate it was less of a tool and more of an artwork, crafted not just for direction, but for beauty. Scholars still argue whether these detailed versions were for ceremonial use, instruction, or simply one carver showing off. A little prehistoric flex. You continue on the frozen path, and just for fun, you imagine trying to explain this whole thing to someone today. Hey, yeah, instead of Apple Maps, I just stroke this stick for 10 minutes and then head off into a blizzard. Sounds like the start of a really bad indie horror film. And yet, it works. Has worked. Still works, in some circles. Maybe that's the real horror story here, that we lost the patience to trust our own hands. Here's where it gets even cooler, no pun intended. Tactile maps weren't always used solo. Sometimes, 2 or more people would sit around a fire and study one together, passing it between them, correcting each other's interpretations. No, the cliff comes after the bend. That groove's too shallow, it's a deeper drop than that. It became a communal act, like rehearsing a play before opening night. Each person added their perspective, which shaped how the journey would unfold. So when you set out, you weren't just carrying the map, you were carrying everyone else's knowledge too. That collective aspect makes you wonder. Maybe the map was never just about geography. Maybe it was a trust exercise. A way to say, I believe your memory will guide me, even when the sky is overcast and the stars are hiding. You know, kind of like borrowing someone's Netflix login, but with slightly higher stakes. Sometimes, of course, there were disagreements. A hunter might carve a feature one way, and another might argue, no, the river bends this much farther north. But even these contradictions served a purpose. They sparked conversations. They forced memory to stretch and adjust. And in that tug-of-war between certainty and doubt, something precious emerged, a shared version of truth, built not on satellite imagery but lived experience. This leads to a curious observation: the very act of carving became a form of storytelling. Each notch wasn't just a measurement, it was a narrative choice. Here's where we saw the bare tracks. This scratch. That's where my sled cracked in half. Like ancient social media posts, except instead of doom scrolling, you're passively absorbing practical survival tips and emotional family moments. Honestly, a little more useful than someone's brunch pic. You press on, your sled gliding over terrain so familiar it no longer registers as external. Every bump under your runners echoes a bump you once felt with your fingers. The land doesn't surprise you, it confirms what you already know. And there's something deeply soothing about that. Like tracing your childhood route to school with your eyes closed, muscle memory leading the way while your mind drifts gently into something softer. And there, on the horizon, a cluster of lights, the next camp. You smile a little. You didn't need to check your direction. You just knew. And even if the map's not in your hand, it's in your breath, your skin, your pace. You made it because someone taught you how to feel your way forward. And because you trusted them, and yourself, you're here. In the dark, in the cold, exactly where you meant to be. And all because once, someone handed you a piece of driftwood and said, follow this. Your fingers are still tingling a bit from the cold, but they're also tingling from memory, the kind that settles in deep, like a song you haven't heard in years but can somehow still hum in perfect rhythm. The map is gone now, packed away or left behind, but your hands still remember its contours. That smooth stretch for the frozen inlet, the jagged cut where the cliff rises sharp, the gentle hollow that meant a good spot for resting. Your body doesn't forget, not really. It just waits for the right moment to remind you. As you coast farther from camp, the stars pulse brighter above. The constellations tonight feel familiar, those same cold pinpricks that watched over your ancestors as they carved maps with only a knife and a long memory. And there's something else. Something you feel more than see. The understanding that none of this was ever static. The land shifted. The maps adapted. And you? You've become part of that tradition now, walking your fingers across invisible terrain, trusting in the ancient choreography of driftwood and intuition. Here's a big historical truth that anchors this moment: while we tend to lump Inuit maps into a single idea, the reality is far more nuanced. Different Inuit groups, like the Kalaalleq of Greenland, the Inupiat of Alaska, and the Inuvialut of Canada, had distinct styles, different environmental challenges, and varying relationships with the land. What worked for one community didn't always translate to another. So the driftwood carving wasn't some one-size-fits-all artifact, it was bespoke. Local. Deeply personal. Like trying to borrow someone else's shoes, you might make it a few steps, but the blisters come quickly. And that bespoke quality extended to who got to carve them. You might assume the elders held a monopoly on map-making, wisdom, experience, all that. But here's a quirky twist: young people were often encouraged to carve practice maps as part of their learning. It wasn't just memorization, it was muscle training. Imagine being 10 years old and handed a chunk of wood with your father saying, "Okay, now show me the coastline to the seal inlet." And if you got it wrong? No scolding, just more walking, more observing, more chances to get it right. Geography became a rite of passage, not a punishment. You pass a wind-carved snowdrift that reminds you of a section of the map, those sweeping, U-shaped bends that indicate glacier-carved valleys. They're subtle, but once you've felt enough of them, you start to notice the patterns. Some carvers even had signature techniques, tiny stylistic flares, like exaggerated peaks or double grooves for important locations. Historians still argue whether these embellishments were meant for clarity, for pride, or to encode secret messages. Was that ridge double-notched because it was a better hunting spot, or because the carver just liked the way it felt? We may never know. And yet, there's something beautiful about that ambiguity. You reach into your pack for a piece of jerky, your modern substitute for seal meat, and chew thoughtfully as your sled dogs rest. You think about how we expect our maps today to be exact, unchanging, full of data points and satellite images. But the driftwood map? It allowed room for interpretation. It invited feeling into the equation. You could argue that a map like that wasn't just functional, it was philosophical. Here's something kind of wild: some maps were never meant to be taken on journeys at all. They were purely instructional, carved to be studied at home, like flashcards made of frozen poetry. A hunter might make one for his son, then burn it once the lesson was learned. Not because it wasn't valuable, but because the real value wasn't in the wood. It was in the knowing. The memory. Like writing something on your palm for a test, then washing it off because now it's inside you. And that's where the emotional weight starts to settle. Because to carve a map was to pass on more than direction. It was to say, "I believe you will make it home." There's something heartbreakingly tender in that. Every groove etched with care. Every angle of terrain turned into a whisper of guidance. And somewhere between the notches, a silent prayer: "Come back safe." You resume the journey, your sled groaning softly beneath the weight of supplies. The terrain has shifted again, flatter now, with low scrub brush breaking through the snow. You recall that on the map, this area was just a smooth ridge, easy to glide through, easy to get lulled by. Which is exactly why you keep your eyes alert. The map reminds you, but it doesn't replace your senses. That's the agreement. The contract between you and the land: remember, but still look. Funny thing about this whole driftwood business, it's not really about the wood. It's about place. About the kind of place that gets into your bones and makes your heartbeat align with the wind. It's not about navigation in the strictest sense. It's about belonging. Orientation, not just in space, but in identity. Where you are is also who you are. And for all its ancient simplicity, the driftwood map can teach us something very modern: that presence matters. You can't rush through this landscape. You have to know it. You have to feel every shift, every dip, every change in snow texture. This isn't an Uber ride. You're not zoning out with a podcast while someone else drives. You are here. Fully. That's the price of survival. And maybe, just maybe, the reward too. You think of the last time you tried to explain this to someone raised on Google Earth. But how do you know where you are without a screen? They'd ask, eyes wide with concern, like you'd confessed to driving blindfolded. And all you could do was shrug and smile. Because it's hard to describe the comfort of knowing something not with your eyes, but with your hands. With your gut. with a sliver of wood and the ghost of a conversation long past. You glance at the horizon again. The wind has shifted slightly, colder, from the north. That means you're nearly at the edge of the old whaling bay. Just a few more ridges and then the long coast. You lean forward, murmuring to your dogs, who respond with soft grunts and shaking fur. The sled begins to move again. And beneath your mittens, your fingers twitch once more. Not from cold. From memory. From knowing. And that's all you need. You press onward, the sled gliding over a stretch of packed snow like a skater in slow motion. The dogs know this path too well, they anticipate every dip, every slight turn, their bodies aligned with some invisible groove etched into their minds. And you're doing the same. Except your groove is carved not into the snow, but into that mental map that lives behind your eyes, beneath your ribs, somewhere deep. Back in camp, there's a story they sometimes tell the younger ones, half lesson, half ghost tale, about the carver who got it wrong. Not maliciously. Just a mistake. A bend placed a little too far east. A coastline cut sharper than it really was. And the hunter who followed it never came back. The story ends with a strange silence, as if even the elders aren't sure whether to blame the carver or the land itself. But it always ends with the same whisper, know what you carve. Because the act of carving, even when done with a simple bone knife and a smooth piece of driftwood, was treated with reverence. And not just because lives depended on it. It was a way of saying, this matters. A way of capturing the ephemeral, the snowdrift that shifts by morning, the tide that freezes differently every year. You weren't just mapping the earth. You were mapping its moods. Here's your historical nugget for the night. In some Inuit communities, certain elder carvers were referred to with titles that roughly translate to path rememberers or iceway keepers. Not formal professions, this wasn't a LinkedIn job title, but social roles grounded in trust and storytelling. Their minds held entire coastlines, their fingers reenacted countless journeys. And when these elders died, their memories, if not passed on properly, were said to melt away like snow at spring thaw. Knowledge had to be shared, or it vanished. Which, if we're being honest, is a pretty poetic way to keep kids paying attention. And there's a fringe detail that pops up now and then in explorer journals. Some claim they saw Inuit navigators use not just driftwood, but carved ice as temporary maps. Temporary as in, extremely. These were not meant to last more than a few hours. But if the ice was thick and clear enough, and the snow light, a skilled hand could trace a shoreline or a path across the floes with a sliver of bone, show the plan, and then, whoosh, let it melt away. Message received, mission remembered, and nothing left behind. Like Snapchat, but colder. Much colder. You reach a small ridge where the wind is particularly sharp. It's not dangerous, but it stings your cheeks, leaving them flushed and tight. You pull your hood tighter, squint ahead. This is where things always got a bit uncertain. The map you memorized, the wooden one, it had this section as 3 humps, then a curve. But the snow can distort shape. You try to trust your gut. 1 hump. 2. Third one's half buried. Then the land opens to the left. You nod. Curve. You're still aligned. And still, the uncertainty remains. Because no map is perfect, especially not one committed to memory and carved from wood. Which is where improvisation comes in. Inuit navigation didn't rely on precise coordinates. It was a blend of memory, observation, and relationship with the land. Historians still argue whether that made it more intuitive or more dangerous. But one thing's clear, it required you to engage. To be present. To respect that the land might disagree with your plan at any given moment. That concept might sound foreign in our age of GPS rerouting. If a turn's missed, your phone chirps and recalculates. But out here, a wrong turn means more than being late for lunch. It means exposure, exhaustion, or worse. So the Inuit didn't just memorize paths, they memorized possibilities. A map wasn't a line. It was a spectrum. If the ice was broken at point A, then route B kicked in. If the tide was low, then an inland trail became an option. Every carved groove implied contingencies. Speaking of grooves, some of the oldest surviving driftwood maps actually show this explicitly. One main path, with smaller, shallower branches curling off like tributaries. Some scholars believe these were alternative paths, others argue they were hunting zones or danger warnings. And yet others say, and here's your debate of the night, that the branches were not paths at all, but wind patterns. Channels of air across certain passes that shaped the snow in predictable ways. Can you imagine? A map not just of land, but of wind. A memory of invisible things. You stop to rest again, not because you're tired but because the view demands it. A wide bay stretches out before you, rimmed by low hills and smooth snowdrifts. You know this place. Not from photos. Not from satellites. But from wood and whisper. From a piece of driftwood once held in your hands, its curves worn soft with tracing. You crouch, dig out your thermos, take a sip. The liquid's lukewarm at best, but comforting. It tastes like camp. Like home. Like before the journey. Funny, isn't it? That something as small and unimposing as a driftwood sliver could carry so much weight. We think of maps today as disposable, something to glance at, swipe past, ignore. But in that tiny carving, someone offered you a part of their world. A translation of terrain into trust. And in using it, you carry their memory forward. There's a running joke back in camp, lighthearted, but also deadly serious, that the real map isn't the wood. It's the walker. The driftwood is just the training wheels. The story gets passed down. Once, a boy memorized every map in his grandfather's stash. Could trace them blindfolded. Knew every groove. But when he went out alone for the first time, he got lost anyway. Because he didn't yet know the snow. Didn't understand how a sudden freeze can change the pitch of a hill. How a banked corner might look familiar but lead wrong. It wasn't until he got stuck, made a shelter, waited 2 days, and watched the land shift around him that he finally understood. Maps help. But experience? That's what saves you. The dogs are stirring again. Eager. They sense the homeward bend approaching. You pack up, pat their heads, murmur nonsense encouragements. And as you take off again, that piece of carved memory, whether in your pocket or just under your skin, guides you forward. You don't need to look at it anymore. You are the map now. The sled creaks beneath you as it eases into a smoother patch, the runners barely whispering over the hardened snow. You lean back, letting the momentum carry you, and for a few seconds, the cold doesn't bite as much, and the wind is more of a song than a sting. You've made it through the coastal dip, the one you knew was trickiest from the driftwood carving's leftmost groove, and now the path ahead flattens into a wide, frozen inlet. The inlet's name translates to something like, where the ice listens. It's not poetic in a Western way, it's practical. Because the ice here is known to moan. Low, groaning sighs that rise up from the depths, like the land itself is remembering something old and heavy. You listen, out of habit. Everyone does. Sometimes the sound means nothing. Sometimes it means you should turn back. But you trust this stretch. And not just from your map. You know it in your knees. You know it in your breath. Back at the camp, one of the older carvers, Arnak, once said that he could tell which bay was which just by the way the wind hit his ears. You didn't believe him, not until he proved it blindfolded. 3 locations, 3 different wind songs. And he got each one right. Arnak's maps weren't just of shape and bend, they were of air and pressure. He would carve tiny notches on the tops of ridges on his driftwood models. No one knew what they meant until he explained, here, the wind will push your scent the wrong way. The caribou will smell you too soon. Like weather forecasting, but with knives and instinct. Historians still argue whether these carvings counted as maps in the traditional sense. After all, there are no symbols, no legends, no, "you are here" arrows. But maybe that's the point. These weren't maps to be read. They were maps to be felt. They were less like atlases and more like sonatas, meant to be practiced until they lived inside you. This is also where things get weird, in a good way. There's a fringe theory floating around, mostly among anthropologists who spend a little too much time in libraries and not enough in the cold, that some of the earliest Inuit maps weren't even carved. They were sung. Imagine this: instead of passing a piece of driftwood from one hunter to another, an elder would hum or chant a rhythm, a tonal path. Not a song with lyrics, but a sequence of tonal shifts, pauses, and pulses that mapped distance, turns, and hazards. Each sound stood for a landmark, each pause for a rest, each high tone for a ridge. Almost like Morse code, but musical. The traveler would listen, repeat, hum it to themselves as they moved. A personal GPS jingle. And if you forgot it, too bad. There's no rewind button on memory chance. You trudge forward now, boots off the sled for a bit to stretch your legs. Each step presses gently into the snow, and you find yourself walking not by logic but by rhythm. Left, right around the bend. Driftwood maps don't show scale the way we're used to. There's no 1 inch equals 10 miles. Instead, they rely on repetition. If the coast curves 3 times in real life, the carving shows 3 lumps. Doesn't matter if each curve is a mile apart or 10. You count the curves. You remember the feel of the third one being sharper, a little tilted. And when you see it now in the snowdrift to your right, it clicks into place. And then you stop, not because you're lost, but because you're exactly where you expected to be. A small outcropping of rock, smooth and black against the endless white. You touch it briefly, like a secret handshake with the land. You've seen it carved into the driftwood map back home, a single spike that juts out of the flat groove, marking this place like a bookmark. You always wondered if it was exaggerated in the carving. Turns out, it's not. If anything, the carving undersold it. The rock looks like it wants to scrape the sky. You kneel by the sled and pull the map from its pouch. Your fingers are thick in their mitts, but they remember the curves. You trace them again, matching what you see around you. There's something oddly sacred about this ritual, this aligning of outer and inner worlds. A quick glance tells you what your mind already suspected: you're exactly 1/3 through the journey. That's when the dogs start whining. Not panic. Not fear. Just alertness. You glance back. A shift in the wind. Not a storm. Not yet. But a suggestion. Like the land saying, "Don't linger." You nod. Message received. You tuck the driftwood away, snap the harness lines back into place, and whisper encouragement to the dogs. And off you go, the sled carving its own temporary groove through the snow, another layer of memory in a land already full of them. Oh, and here's your mainstream historical tidbit of the night. In 1904, Danish explorer Knud Rasmussen documented several instances of Inuit guides using tactile driftwood maps during their travels. His notes, half admiration, half confusion, described the maps as puzzle-like in their abstraction, but shockingly accurate in use. He never quite figured out how they worked. Mostly because he tried to read them instead of feel them. That's the thing about these maps. They're not meant to be understood in a chair with a cup of coffee. They're meant to be lived. Walked. Breathed in through frozen air and breath-clouded beards. You cross the inlet slowly, letting the dogs dictate the pace. The light's starting to shift now, softer, gold-pink where it catches the ice, long shadows slinking across the flats like quiet cats. This stretch, carved into the driftwood as a single gentle curve, is often misleading. It looks harmless. But fog settles here fast, and the snow can hide unexpected cracks. so you stay alert. There's a rhythm to how you move. Left hand on the sled rail. Right eye on the horizon. Mental map replaying like a song stuck in your head. One dip. One rise. Then another cluster of stone markers, like the land's punctuation marks. Here you breathe. Here you rest. Here you remember. And remember you do. The wind is behind you now, a tailwind, soft but persistent, like the breath of the land urging you forward. You let the dogs ease into a smoother pace, almost casual now, tails high and ears flicking back for any change. The snow beneath the sled has that just right consistency, not too soft to drag, not too hard to rattle your teeth. For a brief moment, everything aligns, the weather, the memory, the map. You feel like a needle threading exactly where it's meant to pass. But then, the land shifts, visually, not physically. The snow turns more granular. The flatness wrinkles slightly with long, narrow ridges. Ahead, a line of ice hummocks juts out of the earth like the vertebrae of something ancient, long asleep. This is a place you've only ever felt with your fingers, never seen with your eyes. On the Driftwood map, it was a bumpy sequence, like shallow scars in a line. Your thumb always paused there, uncertain. Now you see why. These ridges aren't just obstacles, they're signals. Silent announcements to anyone who understands, you are near the passage. This is where the ice thins in places, deceptively solid looking on top, with treacherous slush just a few inches below. Not enough to swallow you whole, but enough to soak your boots, freeze your bones, and ruin your day. Your fingers twitch toward the Driftwood map tucked away inside your sled pack. But you don't need it now. The memory is clear. The bumps you felt, 3, then a groove, then 2 close together, correspond perfectly to what you see ahead. The land has opened its palm to you, and the map is the lifeline running across it. Mainstream historians have always been baffled by this accuracy. One 20th century geographer, John K. Wright, famously said, "These Inuit maps are not maps as we define them, they are intimate topographies of survival." And that's probably the best description anyone's managed. But here's where it gets a little weird again. Some Arctic scholars, often laughed out of serious symposiums, believe certain mapmakers use dreams to finalize their Driftwood designs. Yeah, dream maps. According to these accounts, the carver would walk a journey once, sleep on it, and then, guided by images or feelings from the dream, finish carving details they hadn't noticed while awake. No proof, obviously. But then again, how do you prove a dream? Historians still argue whether these additions were real recollections or imaginative embellishments. Some think the dream claim is just a poetic metaphor for intuition. Others are convinced that the Inuit, who valued dreams as tools for navigation, actually considered sleep as part of their cartographic process. Sort of like letting your brain perform a recalibration run overnight. Regardless, you now approach the most delicate part of your journey, the zigzag channel. It doesn't look like much from here, just another patch of snow and wind-sculpted ridges, but you know better. This is where travelers either trust the memory of their fingers or start second-guessing themselves into trouble. You step off the sled and walk ahead on foot. Not because you don't believe in the dogs, but because you want to test the route before they pull your full weight over it. You walk with care. The ice here feels different. Your boots crunch down into the top layer, but you can feel the sag beneath, like stepping on thin paper laid over a bowl. You zig. You zag. You listen to the wind. You watch for patches that shimmer too much, those are the liars. Too smooth. Too shiny. Definitely thin. Your steps mirror the carved rhythm on your map. Left turn, short rise, tiny drop, hard left. There. A patch of snow that looks nothing like the carving, because the carving had a dip, and this spot is perfectly level. Suspiciously level. You prod it with your foot, and, crack. Not a break, but a hairline fracture spiderwebbing across the surface like a frozen lightning bolt. Yup. Just like Arnak warned, if it looks easy, it probably wants to kill you. You back up and reroute. 15 paces to the right, and now the ice creaks differently. Safer. Not quiet, but honest. Honest ice tells you when it's breaking. It doesn't pretend. Once you clear the channel, you whistle for the dogs. They trot forward, pausing briefly at the exact spot you marked. Even they seem to remember it. The sled glides over the safer route, following the new groove you made. A brief thought flickers in your mind: if someone else passed through here later, would they recognize the marks and follow them? Or would they feel them underfoot and carve a new pattern into their own memory map? The thought fades as the land opens again, wide, calm, and touched with golden light. The low sun paints everything with a warm illusion, like a fake summer that you wish you could believe in. Here's your historical tidbit to chew on as the dogs settle into a rhythm again. One of the most detailed driftwood maps ever recovered was found in Greenland in the late 1800s. It spanned almost 150 kilometers of coastal territory, marked entirely by grooves and lumps, and was used by hunters who couldn't read or write but could cross hundreds of miles by memory alone. That map now sits in a museum, behind glass, under perfect lighting, never to be touched again. Which kind of misses the point? You think about that as the dogs pull you into the next stretch. This map you're following, this real one, the one you feel in your fingers and your boots and your breath, is alive. It's not frozen in a display case. It changes every time you take the journey. It teaches you things. It reminds you of what the land wants and where it doesn't want you. And maybe, just maybe, some part of that ancient Greenland map is still embedded in yours. Passed from hand to hand. Carved in wood, memorized in skin. A line, a dip, a curve. A story you don't even realize you're telling. The sled curves along a shallow path now, rising gently into a slope of powdery snow. You feel the altitude shift. Not by much, but enough that the dogs huff harder, and the wind brushes you with colder fingers. A distant bird call echoes to the right, one of those snow crows that always sound vaguely sarcastic. Nice map, it seems to say. Hope you brought snacks. You smile in spite of the cold. The map's next feature is close. A ridge with two humps and a small depression in between. On the driftwood, it looks like a cartoon camel. You named it Humpy when you were a kid. Still do. Even serious navigators get silly sometimes. The moment you see it on the horizon, your fingers twitch with recognition. Humpy. Right on cue. And you realize something simple but profound: the map didn't get you here. You did. The map just reminded you of what you already knew. You ease into the slow rhythm now, the sled gliding over crusted snow that crunches softly under the runners. The dog's breath billows in tiny clouds, dissipating quickly into the cold air. The ridge known as Humpy rises ahead like a familiar old friend, two gentle peaks separated by a small dip, exactly as your driftwood map predicted. You smile to yourself, thinking about how such a simple shape could carry so much meaning. It's just a bump on the landscape, but to you, it's a waypoint on an ancient story. You pause a moment, tracing the mental map against the snow. The path from here arcs slightly, hugging the coast before turning inland toward the next set of landmarks. Your fingers brush the edge of your map, feeling the worn grooves left by years of carving. The wood smells faintly of sea salt and pine resin, a comforting scent that ties you back to home, even as you're miles from it. The dogs shift restlessly, picking up a faint scent on the breeze. You tilt your head, trying to catch it yourself. There's a hint of musk and something else, maybe the sharp tang of fish or the faint trace of human presence. You remind yourself that this land has been traveled by many before you, not just by the Inuit but also by whalers, explorers, and traders, all leaving their own invisible footprints. This brings to mind an interesting historical fact. In the late 19th century, European explorers often struggled to navigate the Arctic's vast expanses, relying heavily on Inuit knowledge and guides. The Inuits' driftwood maps, combined with their intimate understanding of the environment, frequently outperformed the navigational tools brought from Europe, such as compasses and sextants. You might chuckle to think that a carved piece of wood could outperform shiny brass instruments, but here, in the cold, that's exactly what happened. You push forward, the sled surging lightly as the dogs pick up the pace. The terrain begins to change subtly, the flat, icy expanse gives way to more rugged features. Here, the coastline is dotted with scattered rocks and small cliffs, which your map depicts as a series of short, sharp notches. Your fingers trace the path as you scan the landscape, each notch corresponding perfectly to a rocky outcrop, a cairn, or a weathered driftwood log. But here's where the scholarly debates get spicy. Historians and anthropologists still argue whether these driftwood maps represented only coastal geography or if they included inland features as well. Some suggest the maps were strictly practical guides for hunters and travelers sticking close to the shore, while others propose that the maps held encoded information about inland routes, hunting grounds, or even spiritual sites. The truth is probably somewhere in between, but you like to imagine that every groove and notch held a layer of meaning beyond the obvious. You reach the first rocky outcrop and tie off the sled for a quick rest. The dogs pant softly, happy for the break. You pull out a small flask of warm tea and take a slow sip, savoring the bitterness against the cold bite in your lungs. It's in these quiet moments that you really appreciate the old ways, the way the Inuit passed knowledge through generations without paper or technology, using nothing but memory and the physical connection between hand and land. Quirky fact time: some Inuit maps were said to include tactile cues designed to be felt in the dark or by touch alone. These could be raised bumps representing hills, deep grooves for rivers, or even rough textures symbolizing ice conditions. It's almost like the map was a musical instrument, each feature producing a different sensation or note when traced by finger. You imagine a traveler sitting by the fire, fingers dancing over the driftwood, memorizing the landscape like a lullaby. You take a moment to reflect on the way these maps blend art, science, and survival. In a world where every mistake could mean life or death, the maps aren't just tools, they're lifelines, a testament to human ingenuity and resilience. As you continue, the sun dips lower, casting long shadows across the snow and turning the sky into a watercolor of pinks and purples. You lean into the sled's runners, feeling the satisfying scrape against the ice. The path ahead curves sharply inland toward a valley, marked on your map by a deep groove flanked by two raised bumps, the next key landmark on your journey. You wonder how many others have followed this exact path, relying on their carved maps and memories. Each traveler leaves their own imprint, small chips, slight differences in carving style, or new notches added to reflect changes in the landscape. The maps evolve, just like the land itself. You tighten your grip on the sled's handle, feeling a calm certainty settle in. You're not just moving across snow and ice, you're part of a living tradition, a story carved in wood and memory that stretches back centuries. And with that thought warming you against the cold, you urge the dogs onward toward the valley, ready to discover what secrets the next stretch of driftwood map holds. The valley spreads before you like a quiet invitation, nestled between gentle slopes that catch the fading sunlight and turn it into a soft golden glow. The air here feels different, still, almost sacred. You can almost hear the whisper of the generations who have passed this way before you, their footsteps swallowed by snow and time but never forgotten. The driftwood map promised this valley would be a resting place, a natural shelter from the relentless Arctic winds. You slow the sled, letting the dogs pause and sniff the cold air. The scent of moss and distant water drifts faintly on the breeze, grounding you in this small pocket of life amid the stark white. The valley's bottom is scattered with rounded stones and low bushes, all dusted with frost. Your fingers instinctively reach for your map again, tracing the smooth valley shape carved into the wood, feeling the dip where the land falls away and the tiny ridges where you'll need to navigate carefully. Here's a mainstream fact for you: Inuit hunters didn't just use these maps for navigation, they also used them to memorize seasonal animal migration patterns and important hunting grounds. The tactile details in the maps could signal where seals gathered on the ice in spring or where caribou grazed during the warmer months. The map was more than geography, it was a living diary of survival and sustenance. You pull the sled a little closer to the valley floor, and the dogs settle in, panting softly and stretching their legs. It's a perfect moment to breathe in deeply and let the stillness wash over you. There's an almost meditative quality to this place, where time seems to pause, and the map's grooves feel less like directions and more like a storybook, a physical memory etched in wood. Now, for the quirky side, some elders claim that certain driftwood maps could sing when the wind passed over their carved edges just right. Imagine that, a wooden map humming a tune, a secret song passed from one traveler to the next, guiding them home even in darkness or fog. Historians remain skeptical of this, of course, but it's a beautiful idea. Maybe it's not so far-fetched in a place where every element of nature carries meaning. There's also scholarly debate about the extent to which these maps were shared openly within communities. Some suggest that because the maps contain sensitive knowledge, like the location of hunting grounds, they were closely guarded family treasures, passed down only to trusted members. Others argue that the maps were communal tools, part of a broader oral tradition where knowledge belonged to the entire group. You lean back against a smooth stone and close your eyes for a moment. You think about how this blending of memory, map, and story is a delicate dance between keeping secrets and sharing wisdom. Maybe that's why the maps had to be carved by hand and felt by touch, not just information, but experience made tangible. The sun dips lower still, and shadows stretch across the valley like slow-moving waves. You pull the map from your pack and hold it up to the dim light. The valley's contours are clear, the groove representing the main path, the bumps signaling rocks and thickets you'll need to avoid. It's almost like holding a small piece of the land in your hands. You trace the next part of the journey, a steep ascent on the other side of the valley, marked by a series of sharp ridges. The dogs stir, sensing it's time to move. You pack up and settle back into the sled, feeling the tension rise with the climb ahead. As you pull out of the valley and begin the steady climb, you reflect on the relationship between the land and its people. The Inuit weren't just surviving this landscape, they were reading it, interpreting it, and weaving themselves into its fabric with every step and every carving. The map is both guide and companion, a bridge between the physical world and memory. And in this quiet valley, you realize how much you've come to depend on it, not just for direction but for connection. The sled creaks as it begins the climb, the dog's paws gripping the snow with steady determination. You lean forward slightly, feeling the sled's pull beneath you, ready to face whatever comes next, guided by wood, memory, and the endless Arctic sky. You push upward now, the sled's runners scraping against the hard-packed snow as you inch higher on the steep ridge. The air thins, crisp and sharp against your face, carrying the faint salt tang from the distant sea. You can see for miles, a breathtaking panorama of ice floes scattered like shards of glass, snow-clad peaks, and dark patches of open water shimmering under the low sun. Your breath comes out in steady clouds as you focus on the next carving on your driftwood map, a series of tight, jagged lines indicating this very ascent. It's fascinating to realize how these maps weren't just flat, but somewhat three-dimensional, carved to suggest elevation changes and terrain features. The raised ridges and deep grooves meant you could read the land by touch, feeling the landscapes rise and fall even with numb fingers. This tactile aspect is what really sets Inuit driftwood maps apart from other ancient navigational aids. As you rest for a moment, you remember a quirky detail you once read. Some maps included tiny holes drilled into the wood, representing river mouths or sea inlets, and travelers would insert small sticks or pebbles as temporary markers to indicate ice conditions or safe passages. It's like a built-in note system, reminding you not just where to go, but how the conditions might change with the seasons. You smile thinking about how this resembles modern GPS updates, except much slower and, wooden. Historians still argue whether these maps were used primarily for solo travel or communal expeditions. Some evidence suggests that they accompanied hunters on extended trips, guiding groups across treacherous ice, while others believe they were mostly mnemonic tools studied at home and memorized before setting out. Either way, the maps were crucial survival tools in a place where getting lost could mean disaster. You tighten your grip on the sled's handle and begin the final push up the ridge. Your dogs, sensing the effort, pick up their pace. The sled creaks and groans under the load, but the rhythm is steady, almost hypnotic. Up here, every sound is amplified, the crunch of snow, the rasp of wind through sparse brush, the soft panting of your dogs. You pause at the summit, catching your breath and taking in the view. Below lies a vast frozen bay, marked on your map by a broad shallow groove surrounded by smaller notches. The map has been your constant companion through this journey, a piece of wood alive with the land's secrets and stories. Here's a historical fact to tuck away: Inuit communities often held ceremonies and rituals before long journeys, seeking protection from spirits and acknowledging the power of the land. The maps, you realize, might have served a spiritual purpose too, connecting travelers to their ancestors and the forces of nature. Maybe that's why the carving was so careful, so deliberate, almost reverent. You glance down at your worn hands, the skin cracked and rough from the cold, and think about the generations of hands that have held similar maps. Hands that knew every notch, every groove, every tiny bump like a second skin. The descent from the ridge begins carefully, the sled slipping slightly on the icy crust before finding firmer grip. You navigate around jagged rocks and patches of brittle ice, your fingers constantly tracing the map to confirm your course. There's a strange comfort in this ritual, the tactile connection between your fingers and the carved wood, the steady pull of the sled, the sounds of the Arctic all around you. It's a reminder that, despite all the modern tools, there's a timelessness to this way of traveling, a deep respect for memory and nature. You catch sight of a dark spot far below, perhaps a seal-breathing hole or a patch of open water, just as your map predicted. The dogs perk up, eager and alert. You allow a small smile, thinking of how such simple tools carry so much power. With the ridge behind you now, you settle into the final leg of your journey, guided by driftwood and the whispers of centuries past. The air grows colder now as you descend toward the shoreline, where the sea meets the ice in a jagged, restless boundary. The frozen expanse crunches under the sled, but the ice here is thinner, mottled with patches of dark water peeking through. Your fingers tighten around the driftwood map, feeling the grooves that mark this precarious zone, the crossing point where land ends and sea begins. It's a spot both feared and revered, for the ice here can shift without warning, cracking open into deep channels or closing over with new frost. Inuit travelers rely on intimate knowledge of these ice conditions, passed down through stories and encoded in their maps. The map isn't just a guide but a warning, carved with careful precision to keep you safe from the ice's hidden dangers. You glance down at your boots, noticing the thin cracks of frozen spray that have settled during your trek. The wind bites sharp, carrying the faint sound of waves breaking beneath the ice, a constant reminder of the ocean's restless power. You tighten your scarf and adjust your hood, feeling the cold seep into your bones. Here's a mainstream fact: the Inuit use specially designed footwear called kamiks, made from sealskin, which were surprisingly effective at insulating against the Arctic cold and preventing slips on ice. Those boots, combined with driftwood maps, were essential gear for survival on journeys like yours. You think about how technology here is less about gadgets and more about materials and knowledge adapted perfectly to this harsh environment. And speaking of quirky, did you know that some driftwood maps included tiny carvings of animal tracks? These were believed to be spiritual guides, showing where the spirits of caribou or seals might lead hunters or travelers. The carvings served as both navigation aids and good luck charms. Whether you believe that or not, it's a charming thought, imagining a wooden map sprinkled with little paw prints guiding your way. Historians still argue how much these maps encoded spiritual versus practical information. Were they sacred objects, imbued with ritual meaning? Or were they purely functional tools? Maybe the answer is both. Life in the Arctic is survival and spirit intertwined. You carefully navigate a narrow ice bridge, your sled's runners barely holding on as the wood creaks beneath the shifting weight. The dogs are tense, ears perked, sensing the fragility of the crossing. You whisper encouragements, steadying yourself for the final push. On the other side, the landscape opens into a wide bay dotted with ice floes and snowdrifts. The map shows this as a major landmark, a place where travelers often rest and replenish supplies. You breathe a little easier, feeling the familiar pull of the land's embrace. You pause to unpack some dried fish and sip from your flask, savoring the warmth against your cold lips. The dogs lie down, tails wagging faintly, happy for the break. You let your gaze wander over the icy expanse, marveling at how the map's simple grooves match this vast, wild world. As you trace the carved lines one last time before stowing the map away, you think about the thousands of journeys that have relied on these humble pieces of driftwood. Each map is a story, a lifeline, a bridge between human memory and the untamed Arctic. You stand up, muscles stiff but heart steady, ready to continue on, knowing the map will keep guiding you through the unknown. You push forward, the horizon stretching out like a frozen sea of glass, fractured by wind-sculpted ridges and shimmering ice crystals. The cold bites deeper now, but the rhythm of the sled and the steady paw beats of your dogs keep you grounded. The driftwood map rests securely in your pack, but its grooves still haunt your fingers, the tactile memory of the land guiding you onward. You pause near a cluster of icebergs, jagged, ancient giants that look like frozen castles caught in a never-ending winter. The map indicates this spot with a cluster of small indentations, a warning of tricky terrain where ice shifts unpredictably. Here, the ice sings, a low hum as the currents push and pull beneath, a sound both eerie and strangely comforting. Mainstream fact, the Inuits' deep understanding of ice behavior was unmatched. They could read cracks, listen to the ice's sounds, and predict shifts with astonishing accuracy. This knowledge wasn't just survival, it was art, science, and spiritual attunement all woven together. For a quirky twist, some Inuit shamans believed that icebergs were the resting places of spirits, and that disturbing them could bring bad luck or storms. Travelers might leave small offerings or carve tiny symbols into nearby driftwood to appease these unseen forces. Whether or not you believe in spirits, it's clear the landscape was treated with immense respect. Historians still argue the extent to which spiritual beliefs influenced practical navigation. Were maps sacred objects, or were they purely functional? Perhaps, in a culture so deeply connected to nature, the two were inseparable. You steer the sled carefully around a narrow channel of dark water, where the ice has broken apart. The dogs move confidently, guided by instincts honed over generations. You watch their keen eyes, marveling at their ability to sense danger long before you do. As you pause to adjust the map, your fingers brush over a tiny carved notch representing a hidden seal hole beneath the ice, a vital hunting spot. It strikes you how these small details carried so much meaning in life, encoded in wood and passed from hand to hand like precious secrets. The wind picks up, swirling snowflakes around you in a soft dance. The landscape blurs into white and silver, but the map's lines remain sharp in your mind, anchoring you to this wild, beautiful place. You feel a surge of gratitude for the generations who came before, carving these maps by hand, committing the land to memory so you could walk safely where they once trekked. The sled slides forward, the dogs pulling steadily, and you let the quiet of the Arctic night seep into your bones. The map, the land, the stories, they're all one now, guiding you gently homeward. The sun has almost disappeared now, leaving a pale, silvery glow that softens the sharp edges of the ice and snow. The cold presses in around you like a thick blanket, but your breath is steady, your hands sure as you reach for the driftwood map one last time before night fully falls. The map's surface is smooth beneath your fingers, the grooves familiar and comforting, a tangible link to the land and to those who came before you. You guide the sled toward a small inlet marked clearly on the map by a series of interconnected lines, a spot where the sea ice meets the rocky shore. Here, you find a shallow cave carved by wind and waves, a perfect shelter from the swirling Arctic winds. The dogs seem to understand this, slowing down as you approach and settling into the snow with a tired but satisfied huff. Historically, Inuit travelers used natural shelters like this frequently, moving with the seasons and the ice, always adapting. Their maps weren't just tools for navigation, they were survival guides, highlighting where to find shelter, food, and safe passage. This interplay of nature and human knowledge is what made their journeys possible. And now for a quirky detail. Some driftwood maps were said to contain secret symbols only recognized by the mapmaker's family or tribe, like a hidden signature or a code. These secret carvings added layers of meaning, almost like a treasure map within the map. Maybe these were to confuse outsiders, or maybe just to keep the map's true secrets safe. Historians still debate the extent of this secret coding. Did these maps function as practical tools for the community at large, or were they family heirlooms filled with cryptic messages? The truth may lie somewhere in the middle, reflecting a culture where knowledge was precious but also shared carefully. You settle into the cave, the warmth of your breath misting in the cold air. The map rests beside you, a silent companion. Outside, the wind howls softly, but here you feel safe, cocooned in a world carved by memory and wood. Your thoughts drift to the long lineage of travelers who've relied on these maps, not just to find their way, but to connect with their land and heritage. This journey, like theirs, is a story etched into your hands, into the grooves of this driftwood. You watch as the twilight deepens into night, the stars beginning to twinkle faintly above the Arctic horizon. There's a quiet magic here, a blending of past and present, map and memory, land and spirit. The dogs curl up close, and you lean back against the cave wall, letting the peacefulness settle over you. The journey is nearly done, but the map story will stay with you long after. The Arctic night deepens around you, a vast, quiet ocean of darkness dotted with cold, distant stars. The sled lies resting beside the cave's mouth, and your dogs are curled into warm, furry bundles, their steady breathing a soothing rhythm in the stillness. You sit wrapped in your parka, fingers lightly tracing the grooves of your driftwood map one final time, feeling the weight of history in your hands. This moment feels sacred, a gentle pause in the endless rhythm of survival and exploration. The map, carved with so much care and knowledge, has been your guide through a world where technology yields to memory and touch. It's a reminder that even in the coldest, most unforgiving places, humans find a way to navigate by heart, by hand, by spirit. Mainstream fact to settle in your mind: Inuit navigation combined observation of nature, stars, wind patterns, animal behavior, with these tactile maps, creating a multidimensional approach to travel. Their skills rivaled those of any seafaring culture, even without compasses or charts. A quirky last note: some driftwood maps were made from the roots of trees washed ashore after drifting in the ocean currents, believed to carry the spirit of the sea with them. This added a layer of spiritual significance, as if the maps were living objects, imbued with the power of nature itself. Historians still argue whether these maps should be classified strictly as maps or as mnemonic devices, a question that touches on the difference between Western cartography and indigenous knowledge systems. Whatever the label, their value lies not just in their shape, but in how they connect people to their environment. You feel the cold creeping back into your fingers, so you carefully tuck the map into your pack. Outside, the aurora begins its slow dance, shimmering ribbons of green and purple weaving across the sky. It's a perfect, silent finale to your journey. You settle down, the gentle hum of your breathing mingling with the crackling of distant ice. The stories carved into driftwood, the whispered lessons of the land, they linger in the quiet, weaving into your dreams. You close your eyes and let the soft night wrap around you, drifting on memories and ancient paths. Now, as you lie there, the vast Arctic landscape fading into a gentle haze behind your closed eyelids, imagine the quiet touch of driftwood beneath your fingers. Feel the cold air settle softly on your skin, the hushed whisper of wind through snow-covered ridges. There's a stillness here that lulls the mind, a peacefulness born from centuries of careful observation and deep connection. The journey you've taken tonight was more than a simple story. It was a passage into the rhythms of a world that moves slowly, where survival depends on memory and respect. You are part of this endless thread, tied to the hands that carved those maps and to the land that shaped them. Let your breathing slow, your thoughts soften, and your body relax. The Arctic night holds you gently now, as the ancient maps rest quietly beside you, their secrets safe for tomorrow's journey. Rest easy. Sweet dreams.